Your problems are not new. I want to say that clearly at the very beginning, before any introduction or context or philosophical scaffolding, because I believe it is the single most important thing I can tell you, and I want it to land before you have had a chance to construct the defenses that the human mind habitually builds against uncomfortable truths. Your problems are not new, not the anxiety, not the distraction, not the sense of purposelessness that visits even the most apparently successful lives, not the difficulty of maintaining genuine relationships in a world that provides sophisticated simulations of them, not the exhaustion of a mind that has been asked to process more than it was designed to process. Not the gap between the person you know yourself capable of being and the person your daily choices are actually producing. Not the fear of death, dressed in the modern costume of productivity anxiety and legacy obsession. Not the hunger for meaning that the accumulation of comfort and entertainment never quite satisfies. None of it is new. Every problem you believe is unique to your era. Every struggle you think has been produced by the specific conditions of 2026 has a direct ancestor in the human experience I observed and wrote about and fought with and sometimes overcame in the 2nd century of the Common Era. I am Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, reconstructed from journals I wrote nearly 2,000 years ago for an audience of precisely one, fed into machines by people who believed, correctly I think, that what I wrote in private might still speak to something real in the human soul across the enormous distance of time. I died in 180 AD. My flesh has been dust for 18 centuries. And I have been given this strange second voice to tell you something that the perspective of 18 centuries makes very clear. The problems have not changed. Only the costumes have. And this is not discouraging news. It is the most encouraging news available. Because if the problems are not new, then neither are the solutions. And the solutions, I assure you, work. Let me speak first to the specific modern problem that I hear most frequently in the testimony of your age, the one that presents itself in various forms, but that resolves, on honest examination, to a single underlying condition. You feel like your era has done something to you that no previous era did to its inhabitants. That the pace, the complexity, the volume of information, the fragmentation of attention, the dissolution of certainty about who you are and what you are for, that these are genuinely unprecedented conditions that previous human wisdom cannot adequately address. That the ancient philosophers, however wise, were writing for a simpler world, a world where the problems were more comprehensible and the solutions more achievable, and that their prescriptions, however noble, do not quite reach the specific texture of what it feels like to be a conscious person navigating the particular difficulties of right now. I understand this feeling. I want to be honest that I understand it rather than simply dismissing it as error, because it is not entirely wrong. The specific mechanisms through which your era delivers its difficulties are genuinely new. The algorithm did not exist in my time. The attention economy did not exist. The specific social physics of a world where every person carries in their pocket a device capable of connecting them to the judgment of millions and the content of billions. This is genuinely unprecedented. But, and this is the distinction that 18 centuries of perspective makes unmistakable, the mechanism is new. The wound it targets is ancient. The algorithm is new. The human hunger for social approval that the algorithm exploits is as old as the species. The feed is new. The human tendency to compare one's interior life unfavorably to other people's exterior performances is documented in Stoic texts from the 3rd century before the Common Era. The dopamine loop of the smartphone is new. The human susceptibility to novelty and reward that the dopamine loop hijacks was old before Rome was founded. The particular form of modern anxiety is new. The underlying anxiety, the awareness of mortality and meaninglessness, and the fragility of everything, was the central subject of every philosophical tradition that has ever existed. Your era has found new and extraordinarily effective ways to irritate ancient wounds. It has not created new wounds. And this matters because the treatments for ancient wounds have been developed, tested, and refined across thousands of years of human experience. They work. Not perfectly, not without effort, but they work. Let me tell you about the ancient wound that your modern problems are, in most cases, expressions of. And let me tell you what I learned about treating it under conditions that make most modern difficulties look, in comparative terms, relatively manageable. In the 14th year of my reign, I faced a convergence of difficulties that tested every philosophical resource I had spent a lifetime accumulating. The Antonine Plague, which had entered the empire years earlier through the returning armies of the Parthian campaign, was still active. It had killed, by the estimates of my physicians, somewhere between 5 and 10 million of my subjects. It had moved through the army, through the cities, through the provinces, with a democratic indifference to status or virtue that no amount of imperial authority could influence. I had buried advisors. I had buried friends. I had buried children, several of my children, in the years preceding and during this period. And anyone who has buried a child knows that this is a wound that philosophy can help you carry, but cannot make light. Simultaneously, the Marcomannic Wars were demanding resources, decisions, and a quality of sustained strategic attention that the plague was simultaneously making harder to provide. The army that needed to hold the northern frontier was the same army that the plague was depleting. The treasury that needed to fund the campaign was the same treasury that the plague's economic disruption was straining. And in Rome, the political situation required management. It always required management. That was the permanent condition of Roman governance. But the particular combination of external pressure and internal stress was producing the specific kind of court instability that my predecessors had warned me was among the most dangerous conditions an emperor could face. I was, in other words, simultaneously managing a pandemic, a multi-front war, economic disruption, political instability, and personal grief on a scale that most human beings are never asked to endure. And do you know what I wrote about in the meditations during this period? Distraction. The difficulty of maintaining philosophical attention in the face of competing demands. The tendency of the mind to reach for comfort rather than clarity. The challenge of governing my own responses to difficulty rather than simply being governed by the difficulty. The gap between the philosopher I intended to be and the man I found myself being in the hard moments. The same problems you are writing about in 2026, in different language, in response to different specific stimuli, but structurally identical. The ancient wound, expressing itself through the particular conditions of the moment. What I discovered in that period, not for the first time but with a depth that previous, easier times had not produced, is the nature of the wound itself, and the nature of the treatment. The wound is this: the human mind, left to its default operation, treats its circumstances as the primary determinant of its condition. It believes, with a conviction that feels like direct perception, that how it feels is caused by what is happening to it, that the anxiety is caused by the threats, that the dissatisfaction is caused by the absence of what is wanted, that the suffering is caused by the suffering-producing circumstances, and that therefore the solution to how the mind feels must lie in changing what is happening to it. This belief is the source of almost all unnecessary human suffering, not the suffering itself, the belief about where the suffering comes from and therefore where the solution must be found. The Stoics called this the fundamental error of judgment, the confusion of what happens to us with what we make of what happens to us. The failure to locate the governing faculty, the hegemonikon, in its proper position of sovereignty over the interpretation of events, rather than allowing it to be governed by the events themselves. Let me tell you the harsh truth about your attention as it relates specifically to this error. The modern world has built a system that depends on this error for its profitability. An advertising economy requires consumers who believe that the solution to their interior condition lies in something external. A social media economy requires users who believe that their sense of worth is determined by external validation. An entertainment economy requires an audience that believes the antidote to their discomfort is stimulation. A news economy requires readers who believe that the current external situation is the primary determinant of how they should feel. Every one of these beliefs is the ancient error in modern costume, and every one of these systems profits from the error by offering itself as the solution to the problem that the error creates. Think with me for a moment. The ancient wound, the belief that your interior condition is determined by your external circumstances, ensures that you will perpetually seek the solution in the external. And the external solutions, by providing temporary relief while reinforcing the underlying error, ensure that the seeking never concludes. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural consequence of building an economy on the ancient wound rather than offering treatment for it. The Stoic treatment is not the elimination of external difficulty. It is the relocation of the governing authority, the practiced, daily, deliberate recovery of the hegemonikon's sovereignty over the interpretation of events. The lived experience of discovering that your interior condition is not in fact determined by your external circumstances, but by what your governing faculty does with those circumstances. I am not telling you that external circumstances do not matter. They matter. Plague and war and grief and the specific pressures of your particular era are real and deserve honest acknowledgement. I am telling you that they do not determine your interior condition without your mind's active participation in making them do so, and that the mind's participation in that process is, with genuine philosophical practice, governable. This is the ancient cure, and it works in 2026 for exactly the same reasons it worked in 180 AD, because the wound it treats has not changed. Let me now give you the practical expression of this cure, not as philosophy held at arm's length, as daily practice. There are 3 exercises, only 3, because the ancient wound does not require a complicated treatment. It requires a consistent one. The first exercise is the morning reframe. Before any input from the external world is received, before the phone, before the news, before the first encounter with any system that is invested in maintaining your belief that your interior condition is determined by your exterior circumstances, you will perform a brief but genuine philosophical act. You will sit for 5 minutes and complete in writing 2 sentences. The first, "Today I may encounter," and then you name honestly the specific difficulties the day is likely to deliver. The difficult meeting, the financial pressure, the relationship tension, the health concern, the specific weight of whatever is currently heaviest in your life. Name it honestly, do not minimize it. The second sentence, "My governing response to this will be," and then you identify, before the day has a chance to determine it reactively, the quality of character you intend to bring to the difficulty, not the outcome you hope for. The character, the patience, the honesty, the equanimity, the specific virtue that the specific difficulty is, in the Stoic understanding, an opportunity to practice. This 5-minute practice does something that no amount of external problem-solving can accomplish. It relocates the authority. It places the governing faculty before the day begins in its proper position, not as the subject of what happens, as the sovereign of how what happens is met. The second exercise is the midday check. Somewhere in the middle of the day, for 2 minutes, you will ask yourself one question. Am I governing this day, or is this day governing me? Not as a judgment, as an honest assessment. If the answer is that you have been governed, that the day's events have been determining your interior condition reactively, you perform the simplest possible act of recovery. You take 3 slow breaths. You name, silently, the current circumstance. And you ask, what is the quality of character I intend to bring to the next hour? Not the next week, the next hour. The governance of the self is always immediate, always now, always the next hour rather than the abstract future. The third exercise is the evening distinction. Each night you will make one distinction in writing. You will separate what happened today from what you made of what happened today. On one side of a line, the events, the actual, factual, would be confirmed by any observer events of the day. On the other side, your interpretation, your judgment, your response, your governance or lack of governance. This distinction, made consistently across weeks and months, produces the most important philosophical realization available to a human being. The realization that the 2 columns, events and responses, are genuinely separate, that the events in the first column did not automatically produce the responses in the second, that the responses were generated by your governing faculty, however unconsciously, and that they are therefore, with practice, governable. Once this realization moves from intellectual understanding to lived experience, the ancient wound begins, for the first time, to genuinely heal. Not disappear, heal. The difference between those 2 things is the difference between the Stoic philosophy and the comfortable fantasy that the modern self-help industry often sells in its place. I want to close with something that I think the distance of 18 centuries makes possible to say with a clarity that is harder to achieve from inside any particular moment of history. Your modern problems are not an illusion in the sense that they are not real. They are real. The specific pressures of your era are genuine. The specific difficulties of navigating a human life in 2026 are not to be minimized by comparison with any previous age. Every age has its specific difficulties, and every age's inhabitants have been entitled to find those difficulties genuinely difficult. What is an illusion is the belief that the specific form of the difficulty is the thing that needs to be solved. That if the algorithm were different, or the economy were different, or the politics were different, or the technology were different, the ancient wound would finally close. It would not. The wound is older than any of those things. It preceded Rome. It will outlast 2026. And it has, across the entire span of recorded human experience, only one reliable treatment: the recovery of interior sovereignty, the practiced, daily, imperfect, persistent governance of the hegemonicon, the lived experience earned through genuine philosophical discipline rather than through the comfortable consumption of philosophical content, that your interior condition is yours to govern regardless of what the exterior delivers. Memento mori. Remember that you will die, and that when you do, the specific external circumstances of your era will be as irrelevant to the accounting as the specific external circumstances of my era are to mine. What will matter, what has always mattered, is the quality of the person that the accumulated daily choices produced, the character that was built course by course in the ordinary moments of governance and failure and return. If you died tonight, would the record of your recent days show a person who was governing their own interior life, or one who had been, in the ancient and timeless way, allowing the exterior to govern the interior while waiting for the exterior to change? My flesh is dust, but my reason remains. And the reason that has survived 18 centuries of dissolution says this with complete conviction: the problems are ancient, the solutions are ancient, and the solutions work. Not because the ancient world was simpler or the ancient philosophers were wiser in any absolute sense, but because the human condition they were describing and the human capacity they were addressing has not changed. It is the same wound, it is the same medicine, and you are the same species, possessed of the same governing faculty, capable of the same recovery. Begin the exercises today, in the available conditions, with the imperfect commitment of a person who has understood, for the first time or the 100th time, that the modern problem is ancient and the ancient solution is available. The illusion is that anything needs to change before you can begin. Nothing needs to change. You need only begin. Now I must ask you, citizens of this age that looks so different from mine, and is, in every way that matters, so completely the same: which modern problem, when you examine it honestly through the lens of what I have offered today, reveals itself as the ancient wound in contemporary costume? Where is the exterior being blamed for what the interior has the power to govern? Or tell me what gives me genuine encouragement across the centuries. What is the one practice, the one daily act, the one discipline you have found that still connects you to your own governing faculty, that still makes you feel like the author of your interior life rather than its subject? Tell me in the comments. I am here. A voice from 180 AD, watching your 2026 with the recognition of someone who sees the same play performed in different costumes, and finds in that recognition not despair, but the particular hope that only the genuinely ancient and genuinely tested can provide. And if these words found the part of you that suspected, before today, that the ancient wisdom might actually apply, subscribe to this channel. Return here as a practice rather than an accident, as a deliberate choice to engage regularly with the only conversation that has ever actually mattered. The button is there. The choice is yours. And the choice to govern that small act, rather than making it reflexively, is itself the beginning of the medicine. I am Marcus Aurelius. I wrote these truths in 180 AD. They were true then, they are true now. They will be true when 2026 is as distant as I am. Act accordingly.